Hey there, everyone. Welcome to our commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, fought on June 17th, 1775. Now, after years of political dissension between Great Britain and her North American colonies, that political upheaval finally erupted in armed conflict on April 19th, 1775, at Lexington and Concord, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And during this battle, the British Army, under Lieutenant General Thomas Gage, would ultimately retreat back to the confines of Boston. And they would endure somewhat of a soft siege over the course of the next several weeks. Now, I'd like to call your attention to the city of Boston and its surrounding topography. Obviously, Boston has changed a lot in the last 250 years, but the city itself was connected to the mainland via Boston Neck toward high ground just off the map known as Dorchester Heights. Off to the north was the Charlestown Peninsula, the village of Charlestown, and three rather prominent eminences: Bunker Hill, Breeds Hill, and Moulton's Hill. And the Charlestown Peninsula was connected to the mainland by Charlestown Neck. Travelers coming out of Charlestown Neck would go for roughly about 3 miles to the village of Cambridge, where was headquartered the new Massachusetts Army under the command of Artemas Ward. And Ward not only would be commanding Massachusetts militia, but he would be joined by militias from the surrounding colonies of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Ward would set up his headquarters here at the Jonathan Hastings House. Obviously, it is no longer standing, but there is a marker at the site of the Hastings House. It served as Ward's headquarters as well as the headquarters of the Committee of Public Safety, which was an arm of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and it is located near Cambridge Common and near Harvard University. Now, again, over the next several weeks, Boston would be surrounded by the various colonial forces commanded by Ward. There would be somewhat of a soft siege between Ward and Gage's troops pinned up in the city. But on May 25th, Gage would receive not only reinforcements, but three major generals would arrive. And you can see them there from left to right. On the left is Major General John Burgoyne, who would become famous for losing an army and losing a battle, the battles of Saratoga in the fall of 1777, which would change the trajectory of the American Revolution, bringing France and other belligerent nations into the conflict on the side of the United States. In the center is Henry Clinton. Henry Clinton would ultimately become commander in chief and be responsible for the loss, or he would be blamed really for the loss of Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, which would ultimately bring about independence for the United States. But the third individual there on the right, who is very prominent in our story, is Major General William Howe, and he would command the British forces on the ground at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And with the arrival of these reinforcements, with the arrival of these three major generals, Gage in the middle of June decides to go on the defensive. He lays plans for a two-pronged attack. The first prong that you can see there at the bottom of the map would advance south out of the city of Boston and seize the high ground around Dorchester Heights. Again, Dorchester Heights would be, it commands Boston from the south. Gage would send troops out to seize that critical high ground. From the north, he would send men over to Charlestown to seize not only Charlestown, but the high ground on the Charlestown Peninsula and the Charlestown Neck. And from there, push out of Charlestown Neck, advance to Cambridge, and Gage's mind, hopefully destroy the Massachusetts Army under Artemas Ward. And again, the high ground north of Boston, Charlestown, commands the city from the north. It's very, very critical terrain. Gage lays plans to make this attack on June the 18th, but unfortunately for Gage, the city leaks like a sieve. The word is going to leak out that the British are planning something big to Artemas Ward and the Committee of Safety in Cambridge. Today, we call this operational security. Gage does not maintain operational security, and his plans within roughly about 24 hours of being laid are known to Ward and his subordinates. So Ward comes up with a plan himself to move out of Cambridge, move across Charlestown Neck and sees Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill towers about 110 feet above the Charlestown Peninsula. It is a critical piece of high ground. It is out of range of the Copp's Hill Battery located in the north end. We'll see a picture of that in just a moment. And British ships in the harbor cannot elevate their guns, their artillery, to properly reach Bunker Hill. It's a critical piece of ground. And Ward's going to order William Prescott, men from Connecticut, as well as the other colonies, to move out on the night of June 16th and seize and fortify Bunker Hill. And there's a marker here near the Cambridge Common, near Harvard Yard, commemorating the assembly of the colonial soldiers who moved out of Cambridge that night and into the following morning of June 17th. They assembled here on Cambridge Common. Prescott's going to lead his men out of Cambridge, march the roughly 3 to 4 miles across Charlestown Neck and down to Bunker Hill. Interestingly enough, Prescott does not fortify or take up a position on Bunker Hill. We're not sure why. It's one of the mysteries surrounding this battle that has never been fully explained since it occurred 250 years ago. But here is Prescott, his statue, and the Bunker Hill Monument actually atop Breed's Hill. Breed's Hill sits just to the southwest of Bunker Hill. It's about 60 feet high, and this is where Prescott decides to fortify on the night of June 16th and into the early morning hours of June 17th. Another mystery surrounding the battle surrounds Henry Clinton. Henry Clinton tells us in his writings that he went out sometime on the night of the 16th and into the early morning hours of the 17th. He doesn't tell us where he goes, but he tells us that he actually heard Prescott and his men constructing a redoubt on Breed's Hill. Not only does it tell us this, I don't know how he could have seen it. It was pitch black. But not only does he tell us this, but he also tells us that he goes to Howe's headquarters, or rather Gage's headquarters, and informs Gage and Howe that there is something afoot in Charlestown and it ought to be investigated. According to Clinton, Gage tells him to go back to bed and they will address the issue in the morning. Again, one of the mysteries of the battle. Henry Clinton does not fully explain where he goes on the night of June 16th. And he doesn't go into a whole lot more detail about his interactions with Gage and William Howe. And Prescott and his men are indeed obviously up there at work. They're at work through the course of the night into the early morning hours and through the better part of the morning on June 17th, up until the time that the British eventually launched their attack. You can see on a period map the redoubt in the lower center of the map. It was box shaped, about 136 feet on each side. One wall faced to the south. There was a redan, or a triangular shaped fortification, that faced Charlestown, and another wall faced north toward, or back toward, Charlestown Neck. When Prescott gets up the following morning of June 17th, he notices that he needs to extend his fortifications out toward the Mystic River, which you can see at the upper right-hand corner of the map. So through the course of the day, the colonials are going to continue to fortify their position. Prescott is going to order a breastwork to be built that extends off of the southern wall that you can see moving up at a somewhat of a diagonal angle to the right. Then to the left, where you see sort of moving toward 11 o'clock, flèches are going to be constructed, or rather 3 small triangular shaped redans. And then at the other angle, moving again up toward the Mystic River, at roughly pointing toward 1 o'clock, there's going to be a wall or a barricade constructed by the colonials. There's going to be a stone wall out there in that area overlooking a broken meadow with brick kilns and freshly cut hay. The colonials are going to dismantle a fence in front of it, restack that fence in front of the stone barricade, and then begin stuffing the cut hay between the stone wall and the newly reassembled fence to form a barricade that they can defend. And then finally, along the beach of the Mystic River, they are going to construct a small, maybe knee high or so, not much higher, stone and rock barricade to guard the beach of the Mystic River. And today you can visit Charlestown and you can visit the site of the rail fence. It is located, there's a marker there that is located in the Bunker Hill Burying Ground. And off on eventually defending the beach of the Mystic River are New Hampshire men commanded by this fellow, John Stark. Now, roughly at about daylight or so, the British ship the Lively, which is anchored in the Charlestown ferry between the North End and the Charlestown Peninsula. Sailors are going to wake up, they're going to look up, and they're going to see the freshly constructed redoubt atop Breed's Hill, and they're going to open fire. The first shots, the Battle of Bunker Hill, are going to be fired from the British ship, the Lively. Obviously, those shots thundered through the city, waking up everyone very early in the morning of June 17th. Also joining into the barrage are British guns, 24 pounders located here in the Copp's Hill Burying Ground, or near the Copp's Hill Burying Ground, that will bombard the redoubt on Breed's Hill. And you can see there in the center of the image, the Bunker Hill Monument. That was their target, or roughly the area of their target. Gage's headquarters at the Province House, which would have stood next to the Old South Meeting House, made famous in December of 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. And unfortunately now the McDonald's sits atop the Province House. But the Province House was Gage's headquarters. And Gage, on the morning of June 17th, is going to call in his three major generals, his key subordinates, to discuss their plans. Obviously, their plans are going to change. There's discussion about launching an amphibious operation that toward the Charlestown Neck to potentially cut off the redoubt from the mainland and completely surround the redoubt and trap the colonials on the Charlestown Peninsula. But that plan is nixed because there's concern that the British forces could potentially be caught between the colonials on the Charlestown Peninsula and reinforcements moving in from Cambridge. So the plan is eventually going to be solidified, and that plan is to land men on the Charlestown Peninsula near ultimately Moulton's Hill and then assault the redoubt. But the British are going to have to wait until high tide that afternoon. There's concern amongst the British officers that they don't want to land a first wave and have that first wave be stuck and isolated on the Charlestown Peninsula and cut off from any reinforcements because of the tide. William Howe is going to be given command of the operation. He is going to send out orders for the 10 oldest companies, the flank companies, and the grenadier companies to assemble. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in just a moment. And they are going to move out from Long Wharf, rowing across the Charles River to land at Moulton's Hill, or roughly the area where the Charlestown Navy Yard and the USS Constitution are located today. All the while, through the course of the day, the men in the redoubt, the men in the fortifications, constructing the fortifications at the redoubt and on the Charlestown Neck, are going to endure an artillery barrage, not only from Copp's Hill, but from the British ships in the harbor. You can see Prescott there in this Don Traiani printing to the right, and to his left is Dr. Joseph Warren. This individual, Joseph Warren, is a newly commissioned Major General in the Massachusetts Army. He is one of the leading and probably rather unknown and unsung leaders of the Whig movement, of the Patriot movement in Boston in the years leading up to the American Revolution. We know about John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock. Joseph Warren also played a very prominent role, and he is going to make his way from Cambridge to Charlestown to the redoubt and actually report to Prescott. He outranks Prescott. He's going to report as a volunteer to serve in the redoubt during the fighting. Now, Howe is going to land on Moulton's Point toward early to mid-afternoon, he's going to take a look over the situation, take a look at the terrain, and he's going to send for reinforcements. And he's actually going to write to us that upon landing at Moulton's Point, on the first view, it was clearly seen that the rebels were in force and strongly entrenched upon their right in the redoubt that had been seen from the town at daybreak, with cannon and with a large body of troops posted in the houses of Charlestown, about 200 yards distant from the right of the redoubt. Their left and center were covered by a breastwork which reached from the redoubt to that river, being about 380 yards, and the whole extent they occupied about 600 yards. Howe was eventually going to send to Admiral Samuel Graves and instruct him to begin firing on Charlestown. Charlestown will actually burn during the course of the fighting. But Howe is also going to come up with an attack plan, a three-pronged attack. He's going to send his light infantry companies. To talk a little bit about the light infantry, British regiments were organized with 10 companies. What were line companies made up 8 of those 10 companies, but 2 companies were known as the flank companies, the light company and then the grenadier company. The light company was typically made up of the shortest, fastest men in the regiment. They were often used in skirmishing and open order tactics. There's also the Grenadier Company. The Grenadier Company were made up of the tallest men. They got their name from at one point in time carrying hand grenades, although they didn't during the American Revolution. But they were made up of the tallest men in the regiment, and they typically were the shock troops that were utilized during an offensive, during an attack. And oftentimes you'll find throughout the American Revolution, the flank companies and the grenadier companies were siphoned off to create their own battalions to operate in support of the line companies or of the main regiments. And Howe is going to make plans to attack along the beach. He's going to assemble the light companies in a column formation. They're going to initiate the assault sometime around the middle of the afternoon, around June 17th, 1775. And it is just one part of the first overall British effort, the attack along the Mystic River beach. The light companies will be attacking a line held along the beach by John Stark and his New Hampshire men. Now, Stark, as his men were building that stone wall that I had mentioned earlier, that barricade I mentioned earlier, went out in about 50 yards or so in front of that barricade and placed a stake. And he told his men that once the enemy reaches that stake, that is when they are in range. That is when you can fire. And Stark is going to assemble his men and have a line, a rank, 3 ranks deep. As the attack begins, the light company from the 23rd Regiment of Foot is going to move forward. Stark's first line is going to open fire, bringing the 23rd to an abrupt halt. The 4th Regiment of Foot, their light company, is going to move up to take the place of the 23rd. But just as they do so, the Stark's second line moves up, opens fire. That volley brings the 4th Regiment, their light company, to a grinding halt. The 10th is going to take up the lead, take up the advance. But as they do, Stark's third line is going to open fire, bringing the 10th to a complete halt, bringing the attack itself along the beach to an overall halt. Out on the plain against the wall that had been constructed, the barricade and the flèches, Howe is going to lead the attack himself. He's going to become rather a major general directing the overall attack. He's going to become a battalion commander, leading the attack himself on foot, consisting of the grenadier companies in the 5th and 52nd regiments of foot. Now, what's interesting about this painting, another rather famous painting of the battle, is that it depicts the British soldiers moving up the hill over the terrain with their knapsacks on. That's another myth that surrounds the Battle of Bunker Hill. Howe, when he ordered the operation earlier that day, did not order his men to bring their knapsacks, but yet you still see them here on the backs of the British soldiers. Those grenadiers, which you can also see here, they can be picked out by their tall bearskin caps. You can see one standing on the end of the line in the center of the image. The Grenadiers are going to move forward first, supported by the 5th and the 52nd Regiments of Foot. As the Grenadiers move forward, when they get to within 90 yards of that barricade, they're going to deploy into line of battle. But as they do, that is when the militia behind the barricade, behind that wall, they open fire, bringing the Grenadiers' advance to a halt. The Grenadiers are then going to make the mistake of stopping to return fire, standing out in the open, less than 100 yards, well within range of the colonial muskets. The 5th and 52nd are not going to stop. They're going to slam into the backs of the Grenadiers, and the attack is going to fall apart. And then Howe is going to pull his men back to reform for another attack. Over near Breed's Hill, near the redoubt, Howe's second in command, Brigadier General Robert Pigot, is going to launch an attack with the 38th, the 43rd Regiments of Foot, some light and grenadier companies, along with the 47th Regiment of Foot and the 1st Marine Battalion. That attack is going to be repulsed. And Howe, as he begins to reform his attack, is going to right afterwards, as he's reforming his men, as he's seen his men go forward and push back, repulsed by the colonials, repulsed by the enemy, he will write that it was a moment that he had never felt before. So Howe's going to form for a second attack. He's going to pull those light infantry companies off the beach to support the attack against the flèches and against the barricade, against the wall. In that second attack, the light and the grenadier companies are going to attack the rail fence. The 5th and the 52nd Regiment is going to attack the flèches. They're going to move forward again. Howe, again, leading his men forward, and they are going to be repulsed for a second time. They make the mistake once again of stopping to return fire when they come within musket range. Pigot is going to make an attempt to try to flank the redoubt. He sends the 47th Regiment of Foot, the 1st Marines, around to get between the redoubt and the smoldering ruins of Charlestown, but that attack is also repulsed. So Howe is going to form for a third time, this time against the rail fence, against the flèches. He's going to send the light infantry against the rail fence, and he decides then to send in a single line the Grenadiers, the 5th, the 52nd Regiment of Foot against the flèches and that breastwork, trying to pinch off, squeeze off that the redoubt atop Breed's Hill. Moving forward in this third attack is an officer in the 5th Regiment of Foot, Lord Francis Rowden, who would go on to gain some fame later on in the war during the Southern campaigns. And Rowden is going to write to us, or after the battle, right after the battle, our men grew impatient and all crying, push on, advance with infinite spirit to attack the work with their small arms. As soon as the rebels perceived this, they rose up and poured in so heavy a fire upon us that the oldest officers say they never saw a sharper action. They kept up this fire until we were within 10 yards of them. Nay, they even knocked down my captain close beside me. After we got into the ditch of the entrenchment, there are a few instances of regular troops defending a redoubt till the enemy were in the very ditch of it. I received no hurt of any kind, but a ball passed through a close cap, which I had. British, by sheer mass of numbers, by sheer will, are going to begin to overwhelm the flèches and overwhelm and get up into and penetrate the walls of the redoubt. Pigot is going to be sending his men forward, the lights and the grenadier companies in the center of his line, the 1st and the 47th trying to flank around again to get behind the redoubt and cut off the colonials in the redoubt. The 38th and the 43rd also pushing forward, those two regiments. Moving up and into the redoubt, eventually the British are going to engage Prescott's men in hand-to-hand combat. And this is the famous painting, my background, by the way, that was done by John Trumbull. You can see to the left, it depicts, or left center, depicts the death of Joseph Warren. And to the right, in the hand-to-hand combat, again, you see the death of Major John Pitcairn, who is commanding the 1st Battalion of the Marines. I'll talk about him a little bit more in just a moment. But Pitcairn's adjutant during the fighting in the redoubt, a fellow named John Waller, is going to write afterwards that nothing could be more shocking than the carnage that followed the storming of this work. We tumbled over the dead to get to the living, who were crawling out of the gorge of the redoubt. 'Twas streaming with blood. and strewed with the dead and dying men, the soldiers stabbing some and dashing out the brains of the others. Falling in this attack is Major John Pitcairn. Pitcairn is one of the more interesting characters to emerge, I believe, from the early days of the American Revolution. He was present on Lexington Green the morning of April 19th, 1775, when the first shots of the war were fired. He had actually been in Boston since December. He'd been stationed there since December of 1774. And he billeted, stayed with a family in the city rather than staying aboard the ships. And the family's name was Shaw. And the patriarch of that family that Pitcairn billeted with, Francis Shaw, was the great, great, great grandfather of Robert Gould Shaw, who commanded the 54th Massachusetts Infantry and who died in the attack on Battery Wagner, July 18th, 1863. And you can see here on Boston Common across from the Massachusetts State House, the famous Augustus St. Gaudens monument to Shaw and the 54th. So there is a very, I feel, very cool connection from the Battle of Bunker Hill to the fighting, some of the most famous fighting of the American Civil War at Battery Wagner between Pitcairn and the Shaws. Eventually, Howe's men are going to overwhelm and capture Breed's Hill, and the Colonials will pull back across Charlestown Neck and back toward their camps at Cambridge. Within several days of the battle, George Washington will arrive to take command of the Colonial Army, now the Continental Army, outside of Boston. Thomas Gage will eventually be sent home back to London. William Howe will take his place commanding in Boston. And once again, just like before the Battle of Breed's Hill, before the Battle of Bunker Hill, the two sides will engage in somewhat of a soft siege through the winter and into the early months of 1776. And that siege is not going to be broken until Henry Knox, who you see there on the left, is going to bring captured artillery from the Fort Ticonderoga along Lake Champlain in New York all the way to Boston. They're going to position them, the Continentals, atop Dorchester Heights south of the city. You can see it there circled on the Steve Stanley map. And once those guns are positioned on Dorchester Heights, they can command the city as well as the ships in the harbor. Howe, who had been making plans, in fact, to abandon Boston before the placement of those guns, is going to have his plans accelerated, and Boston will eventually be evacuated on St. Patrick's Day, 1776, ending the siege. But very soon, William Howe and George Washington are going to be racing toward New York. And later on that summer, fighting is going to begin in the summer of 1776 for control of New York City. Now, I would like to thank you all for watching and participating in our commemoration of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Be sure to check out our other YouTube videos out there on the American Battlefield Trust YouTube page. And as always, thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. Get inspired at battlefields.org.